I'd like to welcome my special guest, and the first for me to do this with audio and visual is a chat in conversation with Carrie Reichardt. Welcome. It's so lovely to meet you.
And you. Lovely to meet you too.
Thank you. So I've been fascinated by your work, and I've been having a look through your website. Would you describe yourself as an artist, a craftivist, a mosaic artist, or a mixture of all of them put together?
I really don't like labels. I hate the whole idea of labels. And I also think that I've always evolved as an artist. I think you probably would have said that a lot of work I did was craftivism, but I would never say that that's what I do now. It's very hard to define what craftivism is, but I don't consider what I do now in the public artwork to be a form of activism. It just isn't. It's a paid job. I just think I've always had a ethos of wanting to make work that is, it my all the community public artwork I've ever done has always come from a position for 25 years of trying to work with local communities and make them have as much of a voice as possible in that work. I mean, way back when I started in the late 90s and I was just doing mosaics, we would always used to work with groups and try and get them to come up with their ideas and try to reflect that and try and get them to be making it and to be involved as much in the process as possible.
Hmm.
And I think that's because I recognized quite early on that art was a form of therapy for me. It definitely got me over some terrible, mental health issues. And so I saw it such a benefit to myself that I thought that when I went to teach art and when I did community art, I was really like, I couldn't wait to show other people because I knew what it had done and how it helped me.
Yeah.
So that was my ethos and my position behind my work. But over the years, I've done it for 25 years. And you'll know, as an artist, we kind of change, we grow, we
Mhm.
do different things. I went from being a fine art, someone who did fine art sculpture to someone that did mosaics that kind of went into craftivism. But I spent 8 years restudying ceramics. And
Right.
it's just evolved all the time.
Yeah, I can understand that completely because I came at it from the other way around. I started doing a fine art A level and then studied applied arts at university and began making these welded structures and covering them with woven willow because I was just fascinated with textures that I could create for sculptures. So I was coming from it from a very craft angle, but then over the years, my practice has evolved as well and started to use digital technology and other types of weaving and really pushing the boundaries. And then now I'm working almost predominantly in bronze, making pieces for landscape. So it's, yeah, I think
I
you'll
started in bronze at Leeds
oh,
Poly. I
really?
remember doing bronze casting. And you know what I think is funny is the definitions of art, because we've been doing this long enough to know that it changes. I
Hmm.
don't know how old you are, but I'm 54. And when I went to university, you did printing, painting, or sculpture. They were defined principles, and you weren't even allowed to cross over. You
Right.
could, we weren't allowed to. You had to decide which one you were going into, and that's where you were. This
Yeah.
whole idea of craft, I mean, I didn't even know applied arts existed at that time. And now you have all these craft ones, or you have all these multidisciplinarian ones.
Yeah.
And so I find it interesting how the definitions have changed, the kind of way that we talk about art and craft has changed. And I'm long enough to know when craft was a dirty word. It was something my mother did,
Yeah.
and that's become so in vogue. Craftivism helped to kind of give it a bit of an edge, that whole
Yeah.
idea, but all that do it yourself. And you can trace that back really to the early 2000, can't you, where craft suddenly became, there's a section
Mm.
in the bookshop on craft, or the Guardian suddenly has a craft heading. That was
Yeah.
didn't exist 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think, well, I'm 45 now, and when I was studying my art A level, I knew I wanted to do sculpture, and the tutor said, took me to one side and he says, there's definitely a sculptor in the making in you, but he said, I'm worried that if you go the fine art route, they're going to knock the love of making out of you because you're going to have to choose a very strict discipline. And his advice to me at that time was, why not do the applied arts? You get to just immerse yourself in all of these different practices, all of these tools and materials, and just really experiment. And he said, I think that's going to feed that experimental side of you more. And he was spot on. He was so right. And you know, a few years later, we was exhibiting side by side, and I always, you know, thank him for that advice that he
I
gave me,
think
because
applied art came in after. Don't think it existed 10 years before that. When
yeah.
I was in it, I really think you had a choice of graphic design or fine art. And I didn't even apply to do fine art. I was trying to be a filmmaker.
Oh,
I'd gone to Sheffield to apply for fine art filmmaking, and took a film that they found so appalling that they said that if they could, they would have erased it then and there. And they were shocked I'd made it, because they considered it so misogynistic. And so I went to Leeds as a second interview, second choice. And I got there with this same film. And when I got to the interview, they said, no, our filmmaking course disbanded 2 years ago. And I was like, well, what do you do? And they said, we do printing, painting, and sculpture. And I thought, well, I'm not going to get in now because I've come with a film. So I said, well, give me a hammer and a chisel and I'll do sculpture then, won't I? And the guy who was interviewing me, Mick Shawn, gave me a place because he thought I'd be like just as a troublemaker, just gave me this place. So I ended up doing a degree in sculpture when I'd done an art foundation, but I wasn't ever going to go down the fine art path. I was going to go down the filmmaking path. And
yeah.
before that, I was into theatre design and set design. But I think I was sexually assaulted going home
Oh dear.
just before I went to my art foundation. And I think that really changed the way that my whole path went, because I found myself doing art therapy without really knowing it.
Yeah.
And so,
Nice.
all of the way I've gone has just been happy little accidents, where I
Yeah.
think the main thing is that art or craft or making things is the thing that I need mentally, just to keep myself together and normal and straight.
Yeah. Oh, I'm very sorry to hear that. But I'm it's interesting how you can feed even the negative experience into your artwork and what it can
But
give
that's
back
been my
to
whole
you itself.
experience.
Mm.
My whole experience has been dealing with mental trauma, and mental health has been through my ability to create,
Yeah.
which is why I'm very passionate about it. And it's why I really can see the positivity, especially something like mosaic, which is
Mm.
meditative. That's where craft comes in.
Yeah.
That's where you get into the zone, isn't it? Or the
Yeah.
flow, or you're engaged in something where you're creating, but you're also like, it's like the greatest meditation.
Yes, I can completely understand that. I was watching one of your YouTube videos, watching you sort of cutting with the little with the biters and trimming all the tiles and then fitting them in into the pattern. And I can see a lot of similarities when I'm weaving, you know, that you just get into that zone, you've got your materials, you've got your music in the background, and you're just so focused, you can lose yourself completely for hours.
Well, this is what
Uh,
they say about the flow, isn't it, with craft, that
yeah.
you can endlessly lose yourself in a meditative world, but you're always getting slightly better,
Yeah.
because just by the doing it over and over again. And I know that my mother was to knitting what I am to mosaics. My mother learnt to knit when she was 4, in the tube during the war, when she was
Right.
4, and she learnt how to do it on 4 needles, knitting socks for soldiers.
Gosh.
My mum died literally knitting. My mum knitted all the time. There was a time when 4 days a week she was going around all the shops in London teaching all the new people how to knit. And so she was obsessed with knitting. But I've realized that that's what calmed her down. She learned from a very young age to knit. And I think she was always upset that neither me or my sister wanted to knit. We hated it. But you could see how that had influenced me, because obviously I think I was probably hyperactive. I think I'm probably on the spectrum. I'm probably all these, we now have labels for
Mhm.
everything. But I think she knew instinctively to give me one of those colouring in books. Do you remember them? Atari books, where you had to colour in, like, basically they were just patterns and you spent all day long colouring them in,
Yeah.
which is what I did. And now it's so funny because now it's the thing in the supermarket, isn't it? To go pick
Yeah.
up your colouring books and lose
Yeah.
yourself in colour.
It is. And I suppose you can look at the way that you sort of the colouring by numbers and things from your childhood, and the way that you're setting out these huge maps for some of your mosaics, that you've got this huge map that you've designed, and then it's finding all the right pieces and the colours and the textures or the different patterns that you're getting from some of the ceramic and how that's going to fit into that map. in a similar way to how I'm looking at a particular shape, and how I can move the knots or the weaving over that surface and incorporate the different textures in that way.
Yeah, I think we're both quite interested in similar things. I think we're interested in the processes and what that tells us, and drawing from history, but kind of giving it a modern twist. And,
We're going to take a little break now and hear a poem called Pilgrim Queens, written by Sarah Wimbush and produced by Poesy In Motion.
Some brought thread, spindles, bodkins and intrepid hearts. Some wore coifs and doublets with petticoats over gowns. Some brought acorns to scatter with washerwoman's hands. Some wore the roll of the ocean with sea legs. Some did not. Some brought willow bark, feverfew, dried lion's tooth. Some wore scant comfort. Some wore the careless cough. Some brought oiled paper for windows, ulster pillows, dogs. Some wore the flame of a matriarch. Some were mice, some shrews. Some brought rags and worked scraps into squares to patch quilts. Some wore wonder at marlinspikes drawn to the hull. Some brought hard-headed children, remember, resolved, love. Some wore blather, others brought hornbook and quill. Some wore the fury of death with a psalm, some a grimace. All brought God's word in a box to a hopeful place. Know that the Lord has set apart his faithful servant.
Wow, thank you, Sarah, for that amazing soundscape. I just love the way that you combined the poetry and the sounds. It really did help to put you into that moment. So back to my conversation with Carrie Reichardt. One of my hobbies, aside from gardening, is ancestry, and I'm always researching my ancestors and fascinated by what they did. And with working class ancestors, it's sometimes very hard to find information out
you
about them.
can't, because I know that through my own kind of research, how hard it is.
And particularly the
If
women
I've
as
written
well, isn't
about
it?
Well, if they're not written in the local papers, they don't seem to exist. Because when I was doing
Yeah.
the suffragette piece for Liverpool, I had a book that named all the known suffragettes of Merseyside, but it clearly stated these were a middle class or above, because they would be the only people who'd get mentioned in the papers.
Yes.
So all that history just is disappeared.
Yeah, and I think I've been looking at what you're creating for Boston, and I'm just at the beginning of my creative journey for the town of Boston. But it's sort of to delve into a place, to its stories, to its culture, to this rich tapestry of a town, and find which bits are going to influence, because I just love the way how you've got all those layers on your mosaics, from the pictures and the quotes and the different places, and pulling out all these different threads. And I'm really excited to see your Boston Boy when it's finished.
It'll be fascinating for me to see, because I've been working on this for so long, and I've been so absorbed in Boston, and like a detective, really,
Yeah.
joining Facebook groups and trying to unearth interesting things. And I suppose for me, it's like trying to find little stories that, in a sense, tell a bigger story.
Yes.
And so, like, I joined a Facebook group, which is Fishers and Clark, for people who'd worked at Fishers Clark, who then became Norton Print. But they're a company that went for 200 years. And so it was really interesting. By going into those Facebooks, I got photos and imagery that were quite incredible. One of them showed all the people who died from that in the First World War, and it's quite interesting to see the involvement of it. And then they had pictures of like Miss Norton, you know, like the beauty pageant,
Yeah.
you know, and which is so dated. But at the same time, they were producing stickers that have pigs on it that say male chauvinist pig. I think it's really important for us, you know, how we were as society, because we're so changing so quickly, and the eradicating thing, and this kind of whole idea of, I don't know, being annoyed about things, or not, people not having the ability to hold other people's opinions and things, or to understand things in more of context. So for me, it was just like drawing all these little stories that would helpfully show how unique Boston is, but also
with my Pilgrim Woman project, it's now in its 4th year, and that's gone from so many different elements, from doing my initial research to traveling over the Atlantic to try and get that sense of separation that the separatists might have feel, to sort of going into the Harvard archives and going to Provincetown, and then coming back and creating this series of Pilgrim Women sculptures. And the third one in the series is one for Boston. And there's a story that I really want to unpick a little bit more about the women and families that were arrested and put in the jail. But the more I research, then there's other little things that sort of take you off on another tangent, isn't they? And then you discover another story, and you're like, you just see where these things are going to lead you. And
I think that's one of the things that's quite exciting about Boston, is like, because of your piece and the fact that the 3 boys have all been made by women. I always try to bring out those stories that I think are missing, you know, unless you go into a museum and you see, but even there, it's always concentrated on men, isn't it? Let's face it.
It is. Yeah.
Trying to get some things that are modern, from like following the Boston Standard and following those little stories, like in Boston, I think it was the Miss UK, who was a nurse who came back and one of the first people to volunteer back at Boston Hospital. But just those kind of modern day stories, and then also trying to get ones from years ago, like these people who'd won MBEs, or I can't remember her second name, but a Sarah woman who literally set up the Royal Society of Nursing and things, that she should have a whole statue to herself in Boston. Because if you look at one person, but what I do is more, I think of it, it's like, it's a little thing that you can go and look at, and there's enough information that if that interests you, you can Google this person, or you can look this person up, or it will lead you. There's so many points of reference that you can then go and explore.
Yeah, I think I can understand that. So it's not just about one thing, it's sort of entryway is to lots of different items. And I suppose when we as artists are given commissions, particularly for a very specific place, a landscape, you know, what's your starting point? What is it that you go to first to get the ball rolling?
Well, for Boston, I'd done some research to get the job, if you see what I mean, and to apply for it, and then I didn't do any. And then because of the lockdown, I had this great time where I could really look at it quite intently, and I found a really good book. It's the one it's one about the small town or big city. There's this
yes, I've just started reading that.
I thought that was great. I just thought that was fabulous, because it was like little pointers, little interest. It wasn't bogged down. I could read that in 3 days and go, okay, I've got an understanding. Because I think what I always say about myself is I know nothing. I do not know geography. I do not know history. Every time I research a place, I have to kind of go through this tedious idea of trying to remember which king and what the Protestants were doing, or the Catholics. I just don't retain this knowledge.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not academic. So I come with a real blank mind and go, right, okay, what's interesting? And I read that book, and I thought, right, okay, it's all about. And then what I did was I looked up and I saw the coat of arms. And Boston's original coat of arms from about the 15th century is those two mermaids, and the women are supposed to represent Anne of Berlin and some other Duchess Mary. They're Mary and Anne. That's who they would think to have been representative of. But their 15th century coat of arm was 2 mermaids with the Latin by land and by sea on it. it changed. I can't remember what it changed to, but it changed in about the 17th or 18th century. It's still two mermaids. But when I thought about that, it really made me think, yeah, Boston is by land and by sea, because it's the agricultural epicenter. And you think about how they were at the forefront of seeds and manufacturing and canning, and also by sea because of all the idea of the port. It was one of the biggest ports, you know, pre-Victorian, or, you know, now it has all of this seafood. And so it seemed that nothing much had changed. And that was a really good starting point, especially as they were two boys. So I decided to make one boy by land with the mermaids on it, and one is by sea and one is by land. And it's not total, but there's much more about sea things on one of them, and the land one's going to have an awful lot about, you know, the land army and the women, and a lot about, because I was really fascinated all about that idea about the Borstal boys that had been brought and came and built all the, you know, had done all the dredging and changed the land there and things. And so I've made them to be distinct two things, one to celebrate by land and one by sea. So that was kind of the starting point of trying to work out what the idea would be. And then after that, I went to the archive, the archive at the Civil Hall, and went through all of their stuff. But then I kind of got stuck because we were in a lockdown and I couldn't go anywhere. So that's when I started to read the books and go into all these Facebook memories, Boston memories groups.
Yeah, they're such a great resource, aren't they? I think quite often for me, I start with a book and trips to archives and then Facebook groups.
I like the idea of having this very old posters and the graphics from that, and having it side by side with some kind of Facebook snap or a advert that's quite modern.
Yeah, and I suppose as well what you're getting from that is that language and the way that people would talk, you know, both in newspaper articles, but in today on Facebook, how they speak, how they type things out, you know, they type as if they were writing, don't they?
I've got loads of emojis and things like that. I like all that kind of mixture, you know. And I wanted to make it kind of a snapshot of where we are now, but it also to be timeless. So when you look at it, a lot of it's all dated 2020, because I was tracking everything. I was tracking the Boston Standard, Boston Memories, and I think one other thing, I was, for the whole year, I'd been tracking it to see what the news stories were and to get little things, because what I was very conscious of is that while I'm showing all the history, I wanted it to have something that was very people who live there now. I wanted, you know, I don't want to make it just all old English and show how white it was or how this was, you know, even though I tried to tell all the stories of like the Irish immigrants that came and used to work the land. And I found pictures that showed that in the 12th century, Foley's, which was a famous factory, was getting peasants in China to pluck their feathers and send them back to us. And so there's these small things that you know, it's one little picture that you'd have to really look intently to find, but it's that kind of idea of showing the past and the future and try and make it as inclusive as possible.
That part of my project going forward is to do community weaving sessions and try and capture those voices whilst they're weaving away. And I think that, going back to the very start of our conversation, that way of being so engrossed in an activity and then the conversation just flows.
Precisely, that's what I was going to say, because you'll know that the same as me, that if you get a group of people together, you know, and if they were supposed to talk to each other, they wouldn't. But when you're head down and when you're busy doing something, you naturally start, because we know that by women who used to all get together and make a quilt together. It's kind of like a social interaction that's good for us. And that had been the hope. I was supposed to go to Boston and run mosaic classes and have an empty shop unit, but it just all disappeared in COVID. So this was the best that I could do. You know, I had to try and make it inclusive without actually even being in Boston. It's quite a tall order, but you know. But that had been my I know that would have been the best thing. It would have got them to actually physically mosaic lots of it themselves, which hasn't happened, but we have had them make fish and things. And so we've tried to include local people in the making of it as much as we could.
Yeah. So looking at the future, when are we going to see the Boston Boys in situ? Do we have any dates?
To give a date, no. not on a date that I'm allowed to give, because of COVID, because, you know, there's so many things that could stop this from happening.
Mhm.
I believe it's going to be the beginning of July that it
Okay.
officially opens,
Yeah.
around that date. So if that happens, it'll be perfect, because it's June the 21st is when supposedly we get our freedom.
Yes.
So it would be really nice if that happens. And, you know, I'd be, I just can't wait for it to actually, to see what people's responses to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Mine's a little later in the year. I'm working towards a November unveiling. So it'll be the end of November to coincide with Thanksgiving and the Illuminate Festival that happens across the Pilgrim Roots district. So fingers crossed that we don't have any more national lockdowns, and we both get our artwork out there for the public to see.
I'm quite excited for it, because I think Boston's going to have really, like with your work, with the other boys that the other artists are doing, they've got other big projects. I think, you know, it's going to hopefully make a difference. It will make it a destination that people want to go to for its cultural, for it to see the arts and things. That's what I hope.
Definitely, yeah. And I think for the residents and the people that we've engaged, it sort of helps them to leave their own legacy, that they've left their mark on something in the town that they live in. Before we finish off, if people are watching or listening to this, is there a website that people can go and view your work?
Yeah, you can go to my website, which is www.carriereichardt.com, which is spelled Reichhardt. It's not easy spelling, but I also have a By Boston by Land Facebook that I kind of use. But yeah, if you look me up, you'll find stuff.
Yeah, well, I'd recommend that they do. There's so much on there. You know, I had a really good delve through your website, watching your little videos and interviews and looking at some of the artwork that you've done.
Oh, well, I'm glad you found it interesting.
It is very much so. So I just want to thank you again for being my guest for my first in conversation with. It's been a delight to chat with you, Carrie, and hopefully we get to meet in person at some point in the future in Boston.
Yeah, and I look forward to seeing your Boston Pilgrim woman. I think she'll go very nicely with the boys.
I think so. Well, if anybody is interested in the book that Carrie and I have both read, it's called Boston, the Small Town with a Big Story. It's a great read. And if you've listened to this on the podcast, you can also check out the extended version on my YouTube channel. So do check it out, and thank you for listening. Spirit of Mayflower is part of a series celebrating my Spirit of Mayflower project. You can get involved in lots of ways. You can take a look at some of the movies and pictures I took on my journey by heading to the Rachel Carter Sculpture Facebook page. You can also head to my website at www.rachelcarter.co.uk, and there you'll be able to view some of the sculptures I make, treat yourself to a limited edition Pilgrim Woman sculpture, or take a look at some of the online tutorials.
We're riding on the tide with a cargo full of hopes and dreams and 100 souls inside. We're crossing the great ocean. We're riding on the tide with a cargo full